The nightmare of a new order. A Führer, his people, and race. Crimes against humanity. A world of chaos and destruction. This is the story of humanity's darkest hour. The Abyss. Summer 1933. A Nazi film crew documents the early days of Oranienburg concentration camp near Berlin. These are supposedly insights into the daily life of political prisoners. It's too good to be true.
There was widespread coverage in a lot of the rest of the world of a lot of the violence and terror that the Nazis were carrying out, particularly the new concentration camps. They responded with this sort of sanitized presentation of concentration camps, or the denial of the violence that they were causing, in a way that we would today call fake news.
The Nazis present the first concentration camps as places of re-education. In 1933, most of the prisoners are their political opponents, communists and social democrats. Discipline, hard work and a modest lifestyle are to reform them. One of the early prisoners is Social Democrat Member of Parliament Gerhard Seeger. As early as 1934, he speaks out about the torments in Oranienburg. It's the truth behind the propaganda.
I'm sure it's unnecessary to say what's missing from the public version. The groans of abused prisoners, pictures of the detention cells, in short, the truth of the hell that is Oranienburg.
In December 1933, after 9 months of imprisonment, Seeger escapes. In exile at the end of 1934, he publishes this report about Oranienburg. In revenge for his escape, the Gestapo arrests Seeger's wife. After international protests, they release her. She joins her husband in the USA. From the very start in 1933, concentration camps are the symbol of Hitler's rule, a naked threat of violence against anyone who does not bend to the dictatorship. By autumn 1934, Hitler has consolidated his power. Now, he feels secure.
Hitler always directed the NSDAP's energies against a single opponent, defeating it before moving on to the next opponent. And in the process, he made sure his supporters were brutal and violent, but never so brutal as to endanger his coalition with the conservatives.
The consolidation of power begins on January the 30th, 1933, with Hitler's appointment as Reich Chancellor. Observers expect he'll be a weak head of government, and he won't last long. In the last free elections in November 1932, roughly a third of Germans voted for the NSDAP. That means Hitler still depends on outside support, especially from the conservatives and nationalists around Vice-Chancellor Franz von Papen. Hitler's cabinet doesn't command a majority in parliament. His power depends entirely on decrees issued by the 85-year-old Reich President Paul von Hindenburg. Hindenburg believes he can use Hitler for his own ends.
Hindenburg and the coterie around him think they can use the mass support the Nazis have got to effect the changes they want to make to the constitution in a more authoritarian direction. These people think democracy's finished, it's a complete flop, it's failed, it's not working.
In Europe, there's a widespread belief that only strong governments, independent of parties and parliament, can really solve problems. Since the beginning of the 1920s, several democratic governments have been replaced by authoritarian or fascist regimes. 11 of the democracies established after the First World War no longer exist. Hitler now insists on new elections he hopes will give him an absolute majority. he will use the power of the state to neutralize his political opponents. Hermann Göring makes it abundantly clear that the first steps to dictatorship have been taken. The second most powerful man in the NSDAP, now the provisional Prussian Interior Minister, justifies the coming terror.
Besonderes Augenmerk aber gilt dem Volk und Reich zerstörenden Kommunismus. Ihm habe ich den schärfsten Kampf angesagt. Die gesamten Machtmittel des Staates und die geschlossene Kraft der nationalen Bevölkerung werde ich rücksichtslos einsetzen zur Brechung dieser verderblichen Idee.
As head of the Prussian Interior Ministry, Göring can use the police to pursue the Nazis' political opponents. At the end of 1933, he appoints 50,000 police auxiliaries in Prussia. SA and SS men can now hunt communists and trade unionists with all the authority of the state.
Above all, that meant their opponents, their victims, could no longer report violent attacks to the police.
The Nazis leave no doubt as to where all this is leading. When a Jewish lawyer, Michael Siegel, tries to secure the release of a client in custody, he's beaten up by the SS. They take his shoes, cut off his trousers, hang a sign round his neck, and parade him through the center of Munich. But these pictures appear only in foreign newspapers. Even the most restrained criticism of the new regime has become rare in German papers. Suddenly, on the evening of February the 27th, the Reichstag is in flames. An arrest is made inside the building. The young Dutchman Marinus van der Lubbe admits he set the fire. He claims he acted alone.
The National Socialists don't want a single perpetrator. They want a communist conspiracy.
Besides van der Lubbe, 4 members of the Communist International who happen to be in Germany are arrested too. The trial of the alleged arsonists starts in September 1933. During the trial, Hermann Göring takes the witness stand. To him, the verdict is clear in advance.
Hierher gelaufen kommen, den Reichstag anstecken und dann hier mit dem deutschen Volk noch solche Frechheiten sich erlauben. Sie sind in meinen Augen ein Gauner, der längst an den Galgen gehört.
The foreign press follows the trial closely. The result is disappointing for the Nazis. The court acquits the 4 communists on the grounds of insufficient evidence. Van der Lubbe is sentenced to death under a law passed specifically for this one case. In January 1934, van der Lubbe is beheaded. It's still not known today whether he was part of a conspiracy.
You have to emphasize that Nazi propaganda was so effective because of prevailing attitudes. It invoked a serious threat coming from the communists, and that was a view that found broad acceptance in society. If you say, we're not starting it, we're reacting to it, you'll get a lot more support. And that's exactly what the Nazis did, right from the start.
The fire is the cue to start hunting down political opponents. That same night, thousands are arrested. The Communist Party is banned. A wave of violence engulfs the country.
Right from the start, people who were visibly politically opposed to the regime were being arrested, rounded up, beaten up, taken into cellars, pulped by the SA. It was very, very clear that real political opposition was not possible.
Just one day later, the terror was declared legal. Reich President Hindenburg signed the Decree for the Protection of the People and the State, which remained in force until 1945. Basic rights like freedom of speech are suspended.
This is a really fundamental change. This literally tears the heart out of the Weimar Constitution. It destroys individual rights. It's the thing that really enables Hitler's dictatorship.
The Nazi terror receives an apparently legal foundation, but the tone remains radical.
Volksgenossen, meine Maßnahmen, die wir nicht angekränkelt werden durch irgendwelche juristischen Bedenken. Hier habe ich keine Gerechtigkeit zu üben. Hier habe ich nur zu vernichten und auszurotten. Weiter nichts.
From February and March 1933, the National Socialists carry out a clean sweep with all the powers of the state, because Hindenburg has given them carte blanche.
The first concentration camps are set up. It's bare, improvised violence.
These were barracks, places that happened to be standing empty. People were simply locked up or stuck in the cellars. They were tortured, held quite arbitrarily.
And at the same time, the NSDAP are fighting an election supported by the Reich president. Hindenburg and Hitler together for Germany's future. At the Reichstag elections on March 5, 1933, Hitler mobilizes a large number of people who have never voted before. The Social Democrats and the Catholic Centre Party almost maintain their vote, in spite of terror and oppression. The KPD vote, 12.3%, is declared null and void. The Nazis reach 43.9%. Even with all the intimidation, they still have no absolute majority. Hitler still needs his conservative coalition partners. But US Ambassador Frederick Sackett sees the election as a turning point. He writes to Washington,
"Democracy in Germany has received a blow from which it will most likely not recover. Germany has been submerged in a great Nazi wave. The much vaunted Third Reich has become reality."
Broad sections of Germany's population welcome the end of the Republic. The Democrats have surrendered.
If you look at the year 1933, you see a situation where 2/3 of the population voted against the Republic in the last election. They either voted Communist or National Socialist, or for other right-wing parties that were against the Republic. That's a very good basis for an authoritarian regime.
The Germans have seen years of street battles between the Nazis and the left, which democracy could do nothing to stop. Naked violence as a political tactic. Nazi supporters often provoked the fights by marching through working-class areas. Now, people of all classes are voting NSDAP.
There's a feeling that Hitler will be able to end the violence eventually, and that Hitler has the means, he has the strength, he has the party organization, he has the will to stop the violence, which many people really blame the communists for and not the Nazis.
Communists are mainly young men, many of them unemployed. Their fight for a workers' state on Soviet lines scares many middle-class Germans. It forces them into the arms of the NSDAP and its brown tyranny out of fear for the red alternative.
Of course, one can't be so naive as to believe that a dangerous enemy is no longer there because it can't show itself. But it's such a blessing that we no longer see the hammer and sickle.
A diary entry from 1933 by Luisa Solmitz, a housewife and mother in Hamburg. She's never been an enthusiastic supporter of the Weimar Republic. Her enthusiasm for Hitler is not dimmed by the fact that her husband is of Jewish descent. She ignores the Nazis' anti-Semitism as long as she can.
Very many Germans were perfectly comfortable with the violence against the political left. They had no objection to seeing communists arrested and locked up in the camps.
Besides the persecution and murder of political opponents, Hitler is consciously using the new technologies of film and radio to consolidate his power. In February 1933, millions of Germans hear his live broadcast from Berlin's Sportpalast. There's lots of emotion and precious little content, and yet Luisa Solmitz is very taken with his speech.
Wenn wir selbst dieses deutsche Volk emporführen durch eigene Arbeit, durch eigenen Fleiß, eigene Entschlossenheit, eigenen Trotz, eigene Beharrlichkeit, dann werden wir wieder emporsteigen, genau wie die Väter einst auch Deutschland nicht geschenkt erhielten, sondern selbst nicht schaffen mussten.
What the Nazis did, first and foremost, was to anchor that narrative of national rebirth in German society. And everything that emphasized national community in the place of division, national resurgence instead of national humiliation, everything that brought hope of better times, that was the great narrative of the National Socialists, and German society was only too happy to believe it.
Even some representatives of Christian churches have long supported the Nazis. One example is the Protestant priest Joachim Hossenfelder in Berlin, a party member since 1929. He preaches in support of the NSDAP. Shortly after Hitler's rise to power, he holds a Thanksgiving service, during which he describes Hitler as
a flawless individual, molded out of purity, piety, energy, and strength of character.
Sermons like that awaken expectations, and Hitler responds, promising he will govern according to Christian principles.
Die nationale Regierung wird das Christentum als Basis unserer gesamten Moral, die Familie als Keimzelle unseres Volks- und Staatskörpers in ihren festen Schutz nehmen.
Hitler was himself no kind of Christian, but he understood what country he was seeking to run. And he understood that Christian principles were very important to a great majority of Germans.
In 1933, the National Socialist movement throngs into the churches, displaying all its symbols and its uniforms. On February the 5th, there's a memorial service in Berlin Cathedral for Hans Eberhard Maikowski, an SA man killed in a street fight. His burial is like a state funeral.
The fallen have given their lives, all for the man that God gave us to be our Führer.
This is Joachim Hossenfelder's sermon. He sees no contradiction between Christian teachings and Nazi ideology. In 1932, Hossenfelder founds the German Christians Organization, promoting nationalistic populism and anti-Semitism. It becomes ever more influential in the Protestant Church. In 1933, Hossenfelder becomes Bishop of Brandenburg, building a career in the Third Reich.
Few of the people who made it to positions of power were really capable. Often it was down to connections, pure and simple. There were set ratios for the percentage of SA or SS members to be employed in the new organizations. That wasn't always possible in the civil service. You couldn't simply walk into a senior administrative post with your middle school certificate. And so, many state-owned companies employed National Socialists instead.
In the spring of 1933, the news spreads like wildfire. More and more Germans want to join the NSDAP out of conviction or opportunism.
People hear that and they say, well, we may not like Hitler, but we're not going to be rid of him any day soon. The train's leaving the station, and if we don't get aboard, we'll be left behind.
When Hitler takes power in January 1933, there are 850,000 members of the NSDAP. By the end of April, that figure has tripled to 2.6 million. On the 1st of May 1933, membership is closed to new members, until May 1937. few days after the March 1933 elections, Nazi supporters march through Hof on the river Saale. They occupy the town hall to impose a new mayor and fly a swastika banner from the tower. There are similar events in many parts of the Reich where provinces and communities are still democratically governed. Illegal occupations of government buildings like this one in Munich on March the 11th are presented as imposing the will of the people. The government in Berlin forces several provincial governments to resign by invoking the Reichstag fire decree. Reichskommissars, Nazi appointees, replace them. Protests against this violation of the rule of law are in vain.
It's characteristic of the way the Nazis seized power that there was this twin-track approach, that they had massive physical violence and terror on the streets with a kind of pseudo-legal justification for it.
The first politicians leave Germany, among them Social Democrat members of parliament and party officials. Ludwig Marum, an SPD politician from Karlsruhe, believes flight is cowardly. He wants to continue serving the people who elected him to the Reichstag. But with the administration and police increasingly dominated by Nazis, arbitrary arrests are commonplace. Ludwig Marum is arrested and paraded through Karlsruhe's city centre. Then the Jewish parliamentarian is taken to Kislau concentration camp. Marum believes that the Nazis will finally respect justice and the rule of law. He writes to his wife from the camp.
I have got over the trauma of the parade through the streets of Karlsruhe. After stalwartly surviving that, I don't know if there's anything I couldn't endure.
In 1934, Ludwig Marum is strangled by concentration camp guards. His family flees abroad. Diversity is no longer desired in Hitler's Germany. Now that political opposition has been sidelined, every aspect of life is to be subordinated to the rhythm of the so-called national community.
Everything was coordinated into the Nazi movement. So if in the town you had a local Catholic male voice choir, a Protestant male voice choir, a working class male voice choir, all of these would be incorporated into a Nazi male voice choir. The same went for stamp collecting, for anything you can imagine. And that's what the Nazis called Gleichschaltung.
Anyone who stands in the way of this Gleichschaltung is removed. As the Hungarian journalist Stefan Lohant discovers to his cost, he's been living with his family in Germany since 1921. He's editor-in-chief of the Munich Illustrated Press, a popular periodical known for its unpolitical photo stories. On March the 13th, 1933, Lohant is arrested, taken to Munich's police headquarters and thrown into a cell. He keeps a secret diary.
I've been in prison for 6 days now. Why? I don't know. When will I be released? I don't know. What will become of me? I don't know.
For prisoners in protective custody, there was no law of habeas corpus. You could be arrested without any reason and disappear into some camp or other for years.
Laurent spends 6 months in protective custody. He writes,
Outside, a new Germany is coming into being. But in the loneliness of a cell, there's no trace of the intoxication of the masses. Here you see the naked face of National Socialism, the desire for revenge, hatred, lawlessness. 3 steps one way, 3 steps back. How small Germany has become.
Only the intervention of the Hungarian government can secure his release. After leaving Germany, he publishes an account of his time as a prisoner of Hitler's regime and continues a successful journalistic career in Britain and the USA. In 1933, the entire board of the publishers that own his newspaper are also arrested.
The Nazis took control over the press and the media by various means, particularly by financial means, by buying them up, by closing down and censoring all kinds of magazines and newspapers. What they wanted was the press to get their message across.
In July 1933, with a new editorial board in place, the Munich Illustrated Press publishes the first report about Dachau concentration camp. The propaganda pictures give the impression of a benign re-education camp where political prisoners are reformed through hard work and discipline. The camp authorities take visitors on guided tours and pull the wool over their eyes. The Völkische Beobachter, the National Socialist Party newspaper, quotes a Dutch clergyman.
The reports of regular mistreatment belong in the realm of fantasy. It seems to me that some of the inmates are better off in Dachau than they would be at home.
National Socialist propaganda strategy towards the concentration camps in 1933 was purely one of camouflage, disguise, deception. Of course, nobody saw the inmates being beaten up or killed. In reality, they were places of oppression, torture, and terror.
Work makes you free, is the cynical slogan on the gates of the camp. In reality, the prisoners are humiliated, beaten, tortured, and murdered. Dachau is the first concentration camp purpose-built by the Nazis. It will function until the end of the war. More than 40,000 people will die here. Dachau is the model training camp for SS personnel. This is where they learn the regime of terror.
Usually, empathy and compassion prevent us from behaving utterly brutally towards our fellow humans. But by their use of language, by their ceaseless condemnations and lies, the National Socialists turned their enemies into a group that were no longer considered human, and that makes us capable of unbelievable brutality.
During the war, doctors in Dachau carry out experiments on human beings. They expose prisoners to low air pressure to simulate the effects of high-altitude flight on Luftwaffe pilots. All this happens in the middle of Germany, right under the eyes of the population. Anyone can see the truth of Hitler's rule.
The concentration camps, and this should be stressed, were not something that the Germans didn't know about, or the world didn't know about. They were in the newspapers. The regime wanted to make it clear, we have a way to fight our enemies, and this is not something arbitrary, but re-education. And that way you could inform people about the policy while simultaneously concealing what was really going on in the concentration camps.
In spring 1933, the National Socialist dictatorship is not yet fully entrenched. Hitler now demands the Reichstag pass the law to remedy the distress of people and Reich, the so-called enabling law. This allows the regime to issue legislation on its own without parliament. With a combination of threats and promises, Hitler persuades most deputies to disempower themselves. Only the SPD refuses. The communists are already banned. It looks legitimate. In fact, it's the end of the separation of powers.
This law actually does several things. It doesn't only give Hitler the Reichstag's lawmaking authorities, but it actually frees him to a great degree from the control of President von Hindenburg. So this is a really significant step towards consolidating his dictatorship.
Hitler disposes of democracy via decrees and legislation. In July 1933, the NSDAP is declared Germany's only party. Most of the others are dissolved. The SPD are now banned along with the communists. They both continue their work underground. Germany is a one-party state.
The whole thing was carried out formally in a legal context, actually a pseudo-legal context, with legality stretched to its absolute limits.
Readers of National Socialist newspapers have long known that the kernel of Nazi ideology is anti-Semitism. The injustices of capitalism, the economic crisis, corruption, all this is supposedly the fault of the Jews. The hate sheet Der Stürmer is especially aggressive. To make themselves electable to the middle classes, the Nazis rein in their anti-Semitism in public until 1933. But after Hitler takes power, the extremists drop any semblance of restraint. From 1933 onwards, Nazi functionaries give free rein to their hatred of Jews. In Cuxhaven, Jewish businessman Oscar Dankner and his alleged non-Jewish lover are paraded through the streets wearing humiliating placards.
The initiative came from below, without instructions from above. For instance, some sport and gymnastics clubs began banning Jews as early as February, March and April 1933. They were not welcome in football clubs. They were not welcome in gymnastics clubs. It all happened in the provinces. All that happened before there was any edict from above.
This systematic anti-Semitism in Germany raises concerns abroad. In Britain and the US, there are protests and calls to boycott German goods. The Nazis cite this as proof of the Jews' international influence.
The National Socialists are determined to give a clear signal that they will not be intimidated by pressure from abroad. In fact, the precise opposite.
The Nazi regime calls a nationwide boycott of Jewish doctors, lawyers and businesses for April the 1st. Shop windows are plastered with hate slogans and placards, and customers are prevented from entering. In the countryside, the boycott is mainly successful. In towns and cities, it's largely ignored.
At the beginning, the new roles the National Socialists wanted everyone to play were not really entirely accepted by the German people. Not everyone realized in the spring of 1933 that Jews would no longer be normal citizens.
The boycott is intended to last a whole week. After a single day, it's called off. But discrimination and persecution continue.
This is a very typical development in Nazi Germany where something doesn't seem to go down well with the public. The activist element is toned down, called off, but then a legalization follows very rapidly.
The National Socialist regime starts to marginalize the Jewish minority with legislation. A certificate of Aryan, that's to say non-Jewish descent, is required to practice a number of professions. It starts on April 7, 1933, with the law for the restoration of the professional civil service. Non-Aryan state employees are forced to retire. Laws follow aimed at Jewish pharmacists and doctors, lawyers, teachers, and professors.
Jews were somewhere around 1% or a little under of the population. And so for 99% of Germans, what happens with Jews is not that important one way or the other. The government's really able to operate in a space here where it's largely free of the constraints of public opinion just because the issue for most Germans is not that important.
Most people are more concerned with the dire economic situation and their own welfare. Since 1931, Germany has been badly hit by the economic crisis. Businesses have closed, millions are unemployed. The economic crisis has long since become a social crisis.
Almost every German family was directly or indirectly affected by unemployment. There was mass unemployment, men hanging around on the streets with nothing to do, desperate to feed their families. And even people who were in work were afraid they could lose their jobs.
In 1932, 5.6 million people are unemployed in the German Reich. That's an unemployment rate of 30%. In Denmark, it's 28%. In Sweden, over 20%. In Britain, 15%. And in the USA, 25% are unemployed. The global economy is slowly recovering from the 1929 crash. The Nazis take credit for the first signs of recovery, but in reality, they're benefiting from international developments. Hitler decrees May the 1st, traditionally marking the workers' struggle, a paid national holiday, National Workers' Day. Berlin's Tempelhof airfield hosts the first great propaganda rally of the Nazi regime. It effectively portrays the supposed closeness of the regime with the workers. But the Nazis' true face shows through. In Hanover, Walter Ballhauser photographs SA men occupying a trade union office on National Workers' Day, raising the swastika and burning the red flag. The next morning, May the 2nd, SA troops ransack trade union offices and workers' savings banks throughout the Reich.
It was a punch in the face of the Social Democratic Workers' movement. On the one hand, they looted its properties, and on the other, they reached out to its members to win their loyalty. The National Socialists certainly wanted to justify their claim to be a workers' party, and so they actively courted the workers.
On May the 10th, 1933, the trade unions are replaced by the German Labour Front. Its subsidiary, Strength Through Joy, is to keep the workers happy with excursions and holidays.
So, I mean, what is novel about the Nazi regime after 1933 is simply the scale and the energy with which they embark on the program of national economic mobilization. On the front end of this is civilian work creation of different types, a commitment, if you like, to raise ordinary Germans out of the misery of unemployment and to restore the prosperity of the countryside.
Government contracts create new jobs, especially in the construction industry. In Berlin, a new subway line is built along Unter den Linden. Elsewhere, entire districts are torn down and rebuilt, as here in Hamburg's Old Town.
Every day the NSDAP can point to examples of recovery. We're making progress. It really does seem that way. Building, building, building. Academies for the training of finance officials, new ministries, the huge airport at Tempelhof. There are airports in Stuttgart and Munich. It's the same everywhere. Parallel projects running simultaneously.
Economic recovery through job creation. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration starts federal work programs too. Public construction work to stimulate purchasing power and create demand in the economy. At the same time, a national minimum wage and social security are introduced. The success of the New Deal wins Roosevelt re-election in 1936. Massive state intervention and laws benefiting the workers strengthen American democracy. The National Socialist regime banks on public works too. The propaganda industry is especially proud of the new Reich Autobahns. They weren't the Nazis' idea, but no one mentions that.
The Autobahn, the idea of dedicated high-speed roads for cars, are really an idea of the moment. The Italians built the Autostrada in the same period. It's an adjustment of society to the new technology of the motor vehicle. And so, no, teams of engineers and construction companies have begun to sketch ideas of a German national road system already in the late 1920s.
There were Autobahns in Germany before 1933. The first, linking Cologne and Bonn, was opened in 1932. further stretches were planned from Hamburg to Basel via Frankfurt, or from Berlin to Italy via Munich. But a shortage of funds meant that they weren't built during the Weimar Republic. The Nazis are only able to start work quickly because the plans already exist. In September 1933, hundreds of unemployed men are filmed lining up at Frankfurt's labor exchange and marching to the first construction site. Secret reports compiled by Social Democrats in exile in Prague reveal what's really happening at the construction sites.
For the ceremonial opening of work on the Schmölln-Stettin Autobahn, they transported 65 unemployed men from Stettin to the site, filmed them for the newsreel, and then drove them back to the city.
The main aim was to build something big, a symbol cast in concrete that could embody the power and the dynamism of the new state.
The employment figures improve. From 5.6 million unemployed in mid-1932, they're down to 4.8 million in 1933 and only 2.7 million in 1934. Positive developments in the labour market reassure many who till now have had their doubts about the National Socialist regime. But the Autobahns hardly play any role in the recovery. By the end of 1933, barely 4,000 people are employed on the superhighways. The Autobahn is a job creation engine only in the minds of the propagandists. Hitler's economic policy is financed by debt, and at first, its real aim is concealed.
What we know now from the archives of the Third Reich is that the hard core behind that program, right from the very beginning, was the program of rearmament. From the very beginning, it has priority with the regime. By 1934, it's already coming to dominate everything else.
In fact, it's projects with a hidden military purpose, like building new airports, as here at Berlin's Tempelhof, that really stimulate the economy. In 1933, the Reich Air Ministry is created. Hitler makes World War I ace Hermann Göring Reich Aviation Minister. Companies get contracts to build new aircraft, all hidden preparations for war. War, as a way to stimulate the economy and to win land and resources, has already been set in motion in East Asia. In 1931, Japan conquers Manchuria, ostensibly to liberate the population from Chinese rule. The Japanese Empire is nationalistic and authoritarian, and has a powerful military. The international community condemns Japan's invasion of Manchuria. In March 1933, Japan quits the League of Nations. It's already preparing the next campaign against China. Hitler is still far from ready for war. In 1933, the German Reich has a professional army of just 100,000 men. It's allowed no tanks, no combat aircraft, and very few warships. These restrictions go back to the 1919 Versailles Treaty. Hitler has denounced the disgrace of Versailles in countless speeches. Now he wants to ditch the treaty's constraints as far as possible. In his first foreign policy speech, he talks of peace, but he means placing Germany on an equal military footing with the other European powers.
From 1933, Hitler pursued a revisionist and expansionist foreign policy. But this policy was hemmed in by various international commissions and commitments. They represented real obstacles, so he tried to free himself from all of them.
Hitler takes Germany out of the League of Nations and wants the decision endorsed by new Reichstag elections in November 1933. Once again, the regime relies on propaganda. Hitler is looking for still broader support. His speech to workers in Berlin is broadcast throughout Germany.
Sie sollen sehen, dass das, was ich erkläre, nicht die Sprache eines Kanzlers ist, sondern dass das ganze Volk wie ein Mann, Mann um Mann und Weib um Weib dahinter steht.
At the November elections, there is just a single list of candidates.
The reason they held the election was to give themselves further legitimacy and to show that the whole nation is behind us, all the people, not just half of them, as in the March elections.
Participation runs at 95%. Hitler's single list receives 92% of the vote. Beyond the propaganda and the terror, the result signals support for Hitler's foreign policy. 95% are in favor of quitting the League of Nations. Of course, voters aren't told the long-term goal of these policies: war. Hitler's entry into government in January 1933 unleashed a mood of euphoria among many conservative Germans. With Hitler and Hindenburg, they hoped for the reconstitution of the old order. And the symbol for that is the Day of Potsdam. But the old elites will learn that Hitler has no interest in restoring the rule of the aristocracy, the army, and big business. Major General Ferdinand von Bredow writes in his diary,
"If only Hitler would restore order in his ranks. So much hate and anger is spreading from there into the people. It's disturbing the broader lines of progress. Many, sadly very many of his people, don't amount to much."
It's no secret that many top Nazi officials, and many ordinary SA men too, have shamelessly enriched themselves since the takeover.
Between 1934 and 1941, the Reich Treasurer of the NSDAP prosecuted almost 11,000 party members for misuse of party funds or property. After all, if they were victims before 1933, as the party had always told them they were, then they felt they had the right to be compensated now. And if that didn't happen, they just helped themselves.
The Nazis see the state as their property to be pillaged. Ernst Röhm goes especially far. As chief of staff of the SA stormtroopers, he's one of Hitler's closest confidants. In 1934, Röhm pushes for more influence for his paramilitary force that has many more men than the regular army.
The stormtroopers, who'd been the kind of bully boys, the thugs of the Nazi men, beating up their opponents, throwing them into concentration camps during the seizure of power, they didn't have anything left to do by 1934. The opposition had all been completely crushed. There are 4 million young men in the stormtroopers. It's a huge movement. Violent, undisciplined, creating mayhem everywhere. And Röhm tried then to organize it into a substitute army, a kind of mass revolutionary militia.
The high command of the army, the Reichswehr, are ready to fight back. At the same time, conservative forces around Vice-Chancellor Franz von Papen publicly criticized the Nazi leadership. In his diary, Ferdinand von Bredow welcomes this development.
"We're not against the regime, but against its excesses. There's something indefinable in the air."
Von Papen wanted to strengthen conservative influence in the government. Originally, they'd thought that they could corral the National Socialists, but now they were themselves totally isolated. So now they criticized arbitrary rule, the abolition of the rule of law, etc.
In summer 1934, Hitler is under pressure. Conservatives want more power. The Reichswehr insists he tames the SA, and Röhm demands that the SA becomes a people's army.
Hitler knows that to wage war he needs the professionals, and with the best will in the world he can't do it with this bunch of thugs. So he's in a dilemma. What's he going to do? And Hitler solves his problem his way, the most radical way possible, by having the entire leadership of the SA killed.
Hitler even has his old comrade Ernst Röhm shot. More than 100 people are killed. Not just opponents within the party, but also senior conservative figures like Major General von Bredow. He is murdered by SS men on the night of July the 1st, 1934. Hitler's official explanation is that Röhm was planning a coup foiled at the last moment. A law is passed to make the murders retrospectively legal in defense of the state. The illusion of legality is maintained, and many Germans still want to believe it.
We want to live in a world that is predictable and just, where we know if we do this, that will happen. And when something is declared legal, then it must be right. And so anyone who suffers under such decrees must have done something to deserve it.
A month later, on August the 2nd, 1934, President Hindenburg dies at the age of 86. Hitler combines the two roles of Reich Chancellor and head of state. He will henceforth be known as the Führer. Every soldier swears an oath of personal loyalty to him. Hitler has total power.
Even in retrospect, it's shocking to see how quickly Hitler's able to move out of the box that von Papen thinks he's in and move into a position of absolute authority. What Hitler was able to do was harness his considerable skills of political cunning and ruthlessness, and he made use of terror and violence in a way that no one had expected that he would be able to do.
Hitler can now be prevented from attaining his criminal goals only by an intervention from abroad or by an assassination attempt. Both will fail.